It's not from Earth.
But if humans existed here, where have they all gone? They're not evolving.
They're devolving. This planet has a history, Mother. A history I fear we are dangerously ignorant of.
Hello Raised by Wolves fans, fellow Mudbeards, and anyone else who's super interested in the lost and weird lore of Kepler 22b from the cancelled Raised by Wolves series. In this video, we're going to be going over humanity's history on Kepler 22b, the creation of the entity, the potential war that destroyed the planet, and in the end, go over the entity or soul's ultimate goal. But first, I wanted to go ahead and cover some additions to the previous Raised by Wolves video I did, covering the lore of Earth. In regards to the necromancer, the synth model we see Mother is, we get a lot of references to them getting inside of people's heads. There was actually a name given to those who seemed to be driven mad by the necromancer, that being a ticker, as referred to by His Eminence when Marcus was tweaking out. And then another part of Earth I failed to neglect was the potential hidden tragedy between both Decima and Campion. Both having been highly ranked Mithraic officials at one point, they could have potentially actually been in love and had a daughter. This daughter, being known as Vril, likely bore witness to the atrocities done by the Mithraic during the war on Earth, and as a result of this, decided to take her own life. This could have pushed Campion Sturgis to desert and help the atheists, potentially creating a new synth model to replicate Vril, maybe as a way to sort of say sorry to Decima for leaving and going their separate ways. But I also believe that if this was true, Vril could have been programmed to stop the Mithraic if a certain something went down. Likely would have been given more detail or context if a third season came around, but the idea is because of Synth Vril, the atheists were able to find and capture Decima, this leading to the creation of the Atheist Arc. I believe Decima's anger over this could have actually led to her breaking Synth Vril's neck before eventually deciding to fix her. But let's go ahead and jump back to Kepler 22b. When I was rewatching the Raised by Wolves series to figure out what kind of video I wanted to make, this one particular scene led not only to the creation of this video, but the creation of my Lost Lore of Earth video. The area where Mother and Father landed was likely an old kingdom or sanct of some kind that worshipped the entity that we now know as Saul, but will keep referring to as the entity throughout this video. What led me to this idea was some of its crumbled ruins, potentially after millions of years without upkeep, and further evidence would be the many skeletal snakes, the open holes all around, and the trees that look very similar to the trees that Sue became. This line of thinking led me to want to talk about some of the lore here that we might never get an answer to. And while most of this is going to be speculation, and I could be wrong on a majority of it, I do think there are enough pieces of the story there to put together what exactly happened on Kepler 22b. Still not enough to paint a full picture. Now, to move forward with some of these speculations, we have to assume that humanity isn't trapped in a giant time loop, and we're not just constantly being influenced by entities and sending embryos back and forth between Earth and Kepler 22b. No, in my opinion, there's enough evidence to prove that time is consistently moving forward, but history does tend to repeat itself in more subtle ways. By that I mean where we see Earth get left in a more inhospitable state due to the war raging on between two separate factions. I believe likely there was a similar war that took place on Kepler 22b. And I actually think that potentially humanity's origins could have started on Kepler 22b before we eventually made our way to Earth. Now, we also have to keep in mind that the version of humanity we'd be following on Kepler look nothing like the humanity we know of today. Them appearing more as the engineers from Prometheus, if you've ever seen it, or Handsome Squidward if you ever watched SpongeBob, though these are far less handsome individuals. No, by the end of this video, we'll be going over the origins and outcomes of 3 different versions of humanity as a whole. I believe long ago, humanity, through natural evolution, got to the point where they were very prosperous in their technological feats. This is evidenced by the creation of synth models like Grandmother being capable of many amazing things, and many other types of technologies and creations that could be seen as almost magical. And with the creation of Grandmother, there is likely also the creation of a grandfather. Both these synth models likely being created with the same programming, that being to ensure the everlasting life of humanity. This would mean that Soul, or this grand entity we see, was actually just an AI, but not even that, also used to be a synth. Evidence to suggest Soul could be some sort of AI could be how he utilizes the simulations to tamper with different characters, primarily Mother, its frequency being unable to penetrate the magnetic field blocking the tropical zone. And if you look closely when that shield is actually broken down, you can see that this is likely actually a piece of technology rather than the planet's natural environment. But then there's also the way it communicated directly to Otho, the prisoner who basically had his way with several of the Mithraic women who were sleeping during the simulation process and traveling to Kepler. Otho claiming that Sol asked him to be fruitful, and while he could potentially just be a really sick individual, he already admitted that he was kind of that.
I never had any reservations about using inferior beings to satisfy my desires. Perhaps that is why Sol chose me for the task.
I believe during the entity's time on Kepler, it found promise in humanity's devotion to it as a god, essentially moving forward with its influence over humanity being that of more of a deity, rather than a synth created by humanity to help keep them going. If you don't believe humans would ever fall for AI or even fall in love with AI, I recommend reading up on some ChatGPT news. But either way, it's even potentially possible that the more beings this entity influences, the more powerful it itself becomes. But I believe there's also a section of humanity that saw the growth of this entity as a deity, and how it was able to basically bend others to its will, and decided to go and form a different group. This group later being referred to as sort of devil cults, or even technocrats if you're referred to by grandmother. Either way, they would fight back against these believers and the entity's influence by either recording some of the rituals and horrific acts by the believers, or simply utilizing them against them later on down the line, all recorded digitally through these tarot cards. But we still don't 100% know who developed them and for why, just that they document quite a bit of lore, and some things that even the entity doesn't want others knowing about. At some point, the conflict between these two factions led to the entity, or the synth model, or grandfather as you could refer to him, to be captured and put into that ritual we saw Mother get a glimpse of, where they're on what is later referred to by the creator, Aaron Guzikowski, as a birthing prison. Now, knowing that he refers to this as a prison in general, clues us into the idea that whether these birthing prisons were designed for the entity himself, in a way to trap him, or was literally designed to stop the birth of future snakes, which I'll touch more on in a second, it's likely they use the same sort of methods to eventually trap the entity, or soul or grandfather, beneath the planet's surface, leaving him to reside at the planet's core. I believe the hopes were that its influence wouldn't be able to reach anywhere else, but we find that through all these holes that exist all over the planet, Soul is able to actually reach out and influence people. These same holes being covered in the weird pentagonal temples we see, and potentially were used as a means to stop his influence from even seeping out of these holes. Still, there were believers who would bust open some of these temples and potentially send believers down to confront Soul in the planet's core. But where did all these holes even come from? Well, it's possible they were already on the planet long ago before humanity even evolved there. Or what I believe is at some point during the creation of the original snakes, which we still don't know too much about, the snakes themselves were the ones capable of digging these holes. Meaning at some point humanity was sharing a planet with serpents the size of what you see here. It seems that after the entity's imprisonment, Grandmother potentially took the reins as the main leader of a subsection of humanity. And while there were still believers running around busting open temples, I believe during this time the technocrats or the devil cults were the more prominent ones on the planet. But then comes the next iteration of humanity's problems. As seen with almost any sci-fi series, when an AI or robot intelligence decides to start making decisions for humanity, usually it stems from a realistic logistical issue, but the actions taken are usually not what's best for humanity as a whole. By this I mean, at some point, whether it be due to the conflict between both the technocrats and the believers, or even the potential common occurrence of any of the technocrats falling under the entity's influence, it's likely Grandmother inevitably reached the point where she decided the best way to ensure everlasting human life was to devolve them, as in a devolved state they would not only be happier, but wouldn't be subject to the entity's influence. finding humans don't necessarily need intelligence to accomplish everlasting life. We see that there are technologies that can almost instantly mess with the human's DNA. That in both the guy who was operating on Mother and got turned into a blob, or Paul's mouse that got turned into a bioweapon, or even the largest evidence being Romulus's tooth. When it accidentally opened, there seemed to be some form of nanoparticles that immediately devolved the guy Marcus had found. I believe Romulus's tooth, like Paul's mouse, was also set up as sort of a bioweapon by the Trust or the Collective at the time. But cutting back to Kepler's lore, Sol had to find a way to counter this, because if Grandmother was successfully able to devolve all of humanity, it would not be able to spread its influence or ensure everlasting life the way it wants to. So, to counter this, the deity and its believers likely developed a biotechnology in the tree we see from the Pentagonal Prophecy. This tree, after a human sacrifice, would be able to produce a certain kind of fruit that I believe would actually hinder the de-evolutionary process that Grandmother started. Evidence to suggest this would be to when Mother actually puts together that her children are being devolved in Season 2.
I think my skin's getting used to the acid. Look.
Where we see Campion seems to be the only one with scales growing on his hand. He also happens to be the only one who didn't eat any of the fruit, as far as we know. And those who ate the fruit likely were able to continue fighting as believers for the entity. And while other humans were being devolved, the few humans who didn't believe but also didn't want to turn into a weird creature decided instead to escape and do whatever they could to avoid the influence, doing things like wrapping themselves in snake skins and potentially equipping themselves with either technology similar to that we saw in the jump packs in the War on Earth, or even ingesting dark photon energy, similar to Marcus. This would explain some of these cloaked figures' capabilities and athletic feats we see in Season 1. So this leaves us with three factions of humanity: the devolved under Grandmother's care, the believers under the influence of the deity or Grandfather, and who I refer to as the technocrats or the devil cults, whose name might not be accurately represented at this time, but I'm just referring to them as such because we don't really have any other names to go off of. I believe this conflict likely led to at one point Grandmother getting completely destroyed until later on down the line Father could slowly resurrect her. And while the devolved enjoy their time eating moss and swimming around holes, the devil cults likely scattered across the planets in hopes of finding some form of surviving and continuing to fight back against whatever believers remained. I believe the conflict inevitably led to the planet becoming irradiated and inhospitable for human life. This is evidenced by the many kids who died of radiation poisoning when Mother and Father first landed on the planet, with the planet's only real survivors being the devolved and potentially those who ingested dark photon energy. But what was the deity's ultimate goal in the deal with all these snakes and believers? Well, I believe the deity needed some form of technology or birthing machine. Something similar to the lines of Hem that utilized a dark photon processor. Once he was able to find such, he would be able to code the creation of the ultimate life form. This snake being different than any of the other snakes on the planet, as we know that number 7 was the first of its kind in comparison. So with this mystical snake created, in combination with other technologies like the strange Mithraic helmet and a human sacrifice, the entity would be able to accomplish its goal of everlasting human life in the resurrection of the dead. This would solidify the nomenclature that goes along with the necromancer model. We know the necromancer was built from the scriptures of Sol, or the entity, or Grandfather, and while it's hard to see the association in Season 1 with a necromancer, in Season 2, seeing how Mother, the necromancer model, was vital in resurrecting the dead or human life, you could see how those things would be connected. So while Grandmother may have found a way to accomplish her programmed goal for humanity by devolving them, Grandfather, Sol, found his own way through means of resurrection, potentially even maintaining full control afterwards. But there is still some lingering questions I have, like that of the cave paintings. These paintings are the center point of an entire time loop theory, believing that humanity is trapped in an endless cycle of creation. Some refer to it as the Eden cycle, though others have argued this could have been an illusion by Sol to help plant the seeds of belief and ritual in his head, and that like with the Kwisatz Haderach and the Bene Gesserit from Doom and their prophecy, eventually this prophecy could lead beings to carrying the entity or soul back to Earth, or to Earth for the first time. Essentially, this cave is a hallucination and a lie, which we know are prominent means of manipulation by Sol. There's also the potential idea that Soul wasn't an AI created by humans, and perhaps the grandfather to grandmother's existence was a character to be introduced in the future of the series. If that's the case, Soul could have potentially been on the planet the entire time, potentially even being that of an alien life form. But unfortunately, this was all I was able to piece together for the lost lore of Kepler 22b. And while I'm sure there's many more details I'm missing, and many other alternate perspectives that could potentially piece together this story just a little bit further, I hope one day we can actually see the return of this series as a whole. While it did have its problems, these problems were not insurmountable. With a little more focus on the entertainment value and audience engagement, this show already had everything it needed to be a masterpiece of a series. With its attention to detail, its mystery box preparedness, and pure devotion to the story and narrative they're building, you can really tell that it was canceled more for budgetary issues or administration influence than for its lack of creativity. But either way, let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching, appreciate your support, and remember, maybe what you believe should just be yours.